I feel like I'm sitting somewhere nice in the tropics because I hear those lovely birds.
Is that coming through?
Yes, but it's lovely.
We will
It is
open the
nice.
session now, okay?
Okay,
So have a nice session. If you need anything, just let me know.
thank you. Great to see that the audience is already joining. Welcome, everyone. We're a little bit before the hour, so we're just going to wait a minute or two. Please just get comfortable. And while you're waiting, if you want to let us know where you're dialing in from, that is really helpful. Thank you for those who are already sending in where you're from. And thank you for also getting up really early to join us this morning in your part of the world. Okay. I think we're going to get started now because we're already 2 minutes past the hour. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Networking Friday event at the Air Center. We're really pleased to host the iAtlantic. And this is really a group of scientists here with us today, where we're going to learn about the research program's work in the Southwest Atlantic, from ocean circulation to tropicalization to food security and the impact of marine heat waves. So, our first speaker, dialing in from Mexico, is Murray Roberts, who is professor of applied marine biology and ecology in the School of Geosciences at the University of Edinburgh. He has a PhD at the University of Glasgow, examining nitrogen cycling in the Anemonia viridis symbiosis. Murray is senior author of The Cold Water Corals, a contributing author to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Fifth Assessment Report, and co-lead editor of a 2014 United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity report on ocean acidification. He is adjunct faculty at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. Our next speaker, who actually cannot be with us here present today, but Dr. Marie Roberts will present for her is Maria Paz Shidishimo, and who is a physical oceanographer and climate scientist at the Argentine Council for Science and Technology. Our live next speaker will be Jose Angel Perez, currently works at the School of Marine Science and Technology at the University of Vale, Itajaí. Angel does research in biological oceanography, fisheries research, and deep sea biology. Daniel Tha is a PhD candidate researching the economic impacts of climate change in fisheries. He is an economist and has a master's in environmental economics from Free University Amsterdam and master's in international economics from Erasmus Universiteit Rotterdam. He is currently working as a consultant in environmental economics, planning, and socioeconomics at Kralingen Consultoria. So now I hand over to our first speaker, Marie Roberts. Over to you. Thank you. Please use the Q&A to post your questions. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Valerie, and hello everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to bring up some slides for you. So my job over the next 20 minutes or so is to give you a flavour of what the iAtlantic project was all about. We're actually a project that has finished, so it's a shame we didn't do a Networking Friday before now, but we are here and we're delighted to be here to tell you about what's been a near 5-year journey exploring the deep and open ocean Atlantic. We're an integrated assessment of Atlantic marine ecosystems in space and time. So we're trying to understand how ecosystems are functioning and how the changes of the ocean will bring changes in the ecosystem functions that we'll see in the future. Underpinning a lot of our work when we think about the Atlantic Ocean are the major circulation patterns of the Atlantic. I think many of us have heard of the so-called overturning circulation. The technical term is the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, or the thermohaline circulation, that drives the movement of heat and salt and energy across our planet. So if I use my laser pointer here, you can see the warm waters, for instance, moving through past Mexico, where I happen to be at the moment, up through the Caribbean, creating the Gulf Stream, the North Atlantic drift currents that keep Scotland and Northern Europe so pleasantly warm, honestly, compared to how they would be if we were over in the Canadian Arctic environments. That heat is transferred, released to the atmosphere, the water cools, becomes denser, sinks and overturns. So you have these areas of deep water formation, and then the cycle moves around the planet. Now there are projections that this overturning circulation will change, and it could change catastrophically. More scientists are coming forward with very, very worrying projections about AMOC. Part of our science plan has been investigating how the big picture of overturning circulation might influence ecosystem function. But today we're talking about some local studies in the regions off Brazil, which have given real insights into the effects of global change and ocean warming in particular on fisheries and other ecosystem functions. So under a warmer climate, this relatively oxygen-poor, carbon dioxide-rich water will begin to sink to the deep sea at the sites of deep water formation. So the problems are then progressed throughout the ocean. We're seeing deoxygenation in deep waters, warming in deep waters, ocean acidification in the deep sea. All of these things have effects. So what is our game plan? We're actually a consortium of scientists, economists, and social scientists, researchers that came together originally in 2016 to look at the North Atlantic, and we looked through the Atlas program of research at the North Atlantic, and we carried out a whole series of studies that looked at ecosystem function and then developed maritime spatial planning approaches to, across our case studies. And in our designs, we work closely with ocean physicists, which is why Maria Paz is such a valued colleague in Argentina. It's a shame she can't be with us today. In the North Atlantic, we use the transatlantic arrays of instruments that record the heartbeat of the ocean. They record the oceanographic conditions of the ocean, the temperature, salinity, other parameters. And we've added to the capacities of those arrays in the North Atlantic, and now, thanks to iAtlantic, also in the South Atlantic Ocean. There are political mandates behind our work. For instance, the Galway Statement that led to the production of the North Atlantic research programs, and in the All Atlantic context, the Belém Statement gives us a framework through which we can work and fund researchers in Argentina, South Africa, and Brazil. So getting to some of the details, and I won't dwell too long, iAtlantic is a large project. We have around 11 million euros of budget, but we have around 4 to 5 times that budget of seagoing equipment and in-kind contributions to our work. So the research program is valued at around 40 to 50 million euros in total. 36 core partners or beneficiaries, 2 subcontractors, 11 associated partners, and overall we span 16 nations. And I always mention at this point, we work with some of the biggest organizations in Europe and South America to some of the very smallest. Wales Bermuda is a citizen scientist, one individual that we funded in Bermuda with a unique data set on humpback whale migrations. And these are our study areas. We can see we are a true all-Atlantic research program. I think we're one of the very few projects that have taken the full ocean approach. It's very challenging to do so, but we've done that. And we, again, with iAtlantic, we've mapped into these black lines that illustrate where the instruments that physicists have put into the ocean are present. So the AR7 lines, the OSNAP, overturning subpolar North Atlantic program, the Rapid Climate Array, and then the SAMOC and SAMBA instrumentation here in the South Atlantic. In yellow, you can see the study areas. Some of them are very, very large, but we've had activities at sea in all these areas, and we've data mined extensively. So our work integrates across monitoring, the ocean monitoring from these long-term oceanographic arrays, experimentation, both in the laboratory and on the deep sea floor, and modeling. So this is the key of our work. We also collaborated extensively across our sister projects, so-called. For instance, the Triatlas program, funded at the same time as iAtlantic, we've worked closely with to enhance these moorings. I'll talk about that when I present Maria Paz's slides later. I'll now run through the overall objectives of our project. Our project is complicated, but when we break it down, we have 6 simple things that we are trying to do. We're trying to understand oceanography and ecosystem connectivity. We're trying to enhance mapping, because the deep Atlantic is one of the best mapped ocean basins in the world, but still very, very poorly mapped. We're trying to understand the drivers of ecosystem change, and if we might reach tipping points where an ecosystem suddenly flips into an alternate state. The impacts of multiple stressors, think of the warming, acidification, deoxygenation of the oceans, and if we mine the deep sea, what that additional stress might do. And then to make that useful, we need to figure out spatial and temporal management and protection. How do we manage in space, but also be aware of time? There's no point putting a management measure into place if within a few years climate change has driven it to an unsustainable status. At the heart of what we do, it's basically people. How do we build capacity? How do we support people? How do we work with our stakeholders? So what I'd like to do now is take you through the project with just a few examples. And it's a hard talk to give because we have such an amazing consortium of over 180 researchers doing incredible work. But the way we've leveraged this to actually be able to work at a full ocean basin scale is by working across all sectors. So we don't just work with scientists, social scientists and so forth. We work directly with industry. We work directly with government and policymakers, NGOs and the wider public. We've even brought citizen science into our activities. And capacity building and tech transfer is integrated across all our work. It doesn't just sit in a box somewhere where you kind of forget about it. It's integral with every work package, with every aspect of what we do. And without the international partnership, we'd of course been unable to have pulled such an ambitious program of work together. I want to start by telling you a little bit about the expeditions that have taken us to sea, and huge thanks to Cova Orejas in Spain and Boris Dorschel in Germany, who've coordinated our expeditions over the last 5 years. And this just gives you a quick flavour of how many expeditions iAtlantic has either run or partnered with over the last 5 years. There are so many now, I have to spread this onto 2 slides. In red, I've put Imirabilis legs 0 and leg 1, but that was one of our flagship expeditions that I will show you a little bit more about. And I'm absolutely delighted that we had work going on in South Africa and across in Brazil. And this, remember, despite the pandemic, where for 2 years we were all closed down. And obviously for all of us this was terrible, and for a research project reliant on work at sea and work in the laboratory, it was devastating. Looking at our flagship expedition, Imirabilis 2, if I go back 1 slide, this expedition ran from Spain all the way down to Capo Verde, where it spent a month researching the seamounts and abyssal plains around Capo Verde, and returned then to Spain. It was a COVID expedition under all those constraints. We'd hoped to make our way all the way down, if you follow my pointer, to the Walvis Ridge and then into South Africa. but this was lost to COVID, and we were unable to rebuild that. A great shame. But despite that, we've completed 75 deep sea expeditions over the course of iAtlantic. And in Immirabilis 2, we really threw everything at the problem. We had an ROV, the Luso ROV from Portugal, the Autosub 6000 autonomous robotic vehicle from UK, equipped with an environmental DNA sampler, trialed for the first time in the abyss, seafloor landers from Scotland. You can see the Scottish flag proudly flying there. Very complex bits of kit that allow us to study ecosystem function in the abyssal ocean, deep sea camera landers, classical oceanography, fish traps, and classic benthic ecology with corers. So a very, very successful and dynamic expedition. We've also produced a series of outputs, which I hope you find useful. Do share these with your students, with your families and friends. These are short documentary films. We have two versions of this film on deep sea science on board a research expedition. You can click the QR code and watch these. One lasts 5 minutes, one lasts more like 15 minutes, maybe better for students or for school kids. And we made these in response to the challenge that policymakers in particular don't often know what actually has to happen to work in the deep ocean. They hear about research cruises. That sounds like a cruise having a nice time drinking pina coladas on the back deck. They're not really quite like that. What do they cost? What do you need? How do you pull the team together to run it? So these films, with some amazing imagery, thanks to the Schmidt Ocean Institute, give you a really nice insight into deep sea science. So please do share those links with your friends and colleagues. The team behind iAtlantic it's a big project, so it's a big team. This is the leadership group of leads, deputies for each work package. Our regional leads, we have Angel Perez with us today, AJ Schmidt in South Africa, Ellen Kensington in Canada, and Stefan Aki Ragnarsson in Iceland. And the project office team who work with me here in Edinburgh and have done so over the last 5 years. I'll now give you the quick overview of the project. In terms of oceanography and ecosystem connectivity, the work was led by Arnie Bierstock and Didier Jolivet, and they split the work between them, with Arnie producing computer simulations of Atlantic overturning circulation. So we can here trace in the computer the evolution of the overturning circulation and how its strength changes in a model scenario. And you can see here that the models and the observations are starting to really work well together, and that's important, because we now have some of the capacities to be much more predictive about how this major driver of the Atlantic Ocean is going to change. We've also enhanced the observation capacities, especially the ability in the South Atlantic to measure oxygen in the ocean by deploying moorings I'll talk about in more detail in Mireia Paz's talk. I integrated with this work the work on understanding how deep sea biological species are connected one to the other. If these deep sea clams and corals release larvae, those larvae spread into the water column and then move with the currents. So it was very natural to bring the physicists and biologists together in one team to work on that. And Didier has done some really pioneering work actually, looking at the connectivity of deep sea coral populations, how mid-Atlantic ridge vent populations are delineated. That's important, because if we mine the mid-Atlantic and we obliterate an entire genotype, we'll never have any prospect of recovery. We see the role of the equatorial belt in connecting seep fauna. And then the big questions remain, and for future research projects to continue to explore, how will population connectivity change in the face of change to the overturning circulation of the Atlantic? We know it's happened from inferences from the fossil record, but we must be better at making our predictions more realistic in terms of our present day understanding of rapid overturning circulation change. When I move to the next objective, looking at Atlantic ecosystem mapping, I'll summarize an awful lot of work terribly briefly. We've worked at a full ocean basin scale by developing a new objective identification of marine landscape maps that cross the entire Atlantic for the first time. We've worked at the regional scale in many of our regions. There's an example here of predictive mapping of suitable habitat for a series of fish and rays around the Azores. And then we've worked in incredibly high resolution at the very local scale. This is a hydrothermal vent edifice on the mid-Atlantic ridge, and this is the French Prime Minister of the day looking at a 3D reconstruction produced by iAtlantic at Ifremer. Then I think the heart of the project in many ways is the next two objectives. It's how these major changes in the Atlantic impact upon ecosystems. So if we look at the drivers of ecosystem change and tipping points, I'm really happy that Angel will go into this in much more detail, but we've seen across the results the overriding importance of temperature in changing how ecosystems are structured and functioning, which means we're seeing more tropical fish in areas where they used to be rare or not present at all. The tropicalisation of fish fauna. Things are changing, and they're changing really quickly. We've also seen some good news stories in iAtlantic. Our citizen science colleague Andrew Stevenson from Bermuda has been out for about 20 years photographing the flukes, the tail fins of humpback whales. Absolutely beautiful work. By working with a PhD student and scientists in iAtlantic, we've been able to then mathematically reconstruct the recovery of the humpback whales that are passing through Bermuda from abundances of around 1,000, maybe up to nearly 2,500 whales. So if we do bring measures into place, we did bring in a moratorium on whaling, nature can come back. There are good news stories out there, although much of it is deeply worrying and, to be honest, rather bleak. If we look at some of the other big pictures from our ecosystem time series analysis, which relied upon a diverse series of ecological data that we then analysed with a unified statistical framework, we've seen pretty consistent abrupt ecosystem changes in the late 1990s and early 2000s, which are coincident with oceanographic trends, which are from the surface to the abyss. I've mentioned the tropicalisation of marine fauna, and Angel will give you much more details on this. We've seen the increases in humpback whales, and we now have a unified way of doing this work, which we've shared with others. We ran a webinar with West African researchers, of which had around 70 people attend, a very detailed class on statistical approaches to analyse ecological data sets over time. And that's a really nice legacy, I think, for iAtlantic to have. I mentioned that we experimented in a variety of ways, both in the laboratory but also in the field. You'll remember the picture of the lander from one of the earlier slides. There it is on the deck with the team preparing it. So we experimented in the field at the deep sea floor at over 4 kilometers water depth. We've also brought some animals back into the laboratory to look at their vulnerability, for instance, to the particles produced by deep sea mining. And there's some very impactful results there. The take home, and we have a policy brief on this on our website, is that these animals have simply no tolerance to these exposures. These are environmentally realistic exposures that lead to very rapid physiological effects and very quick mortality. You can see at the end of an experiment, most of these deep sea corals are dead. They have no tolerance to the impacts of polymetallic sulfide nodule mining. All this information is no use unless it's organized, compiled, made available for colleagues and for future generations. The mechanics behind that we've put a lot of time into in a variety of ways, and I'd like to give thanks to the team at IMODNet and to University of Azores who coordinated this. You're very welcome to go to our GeoNode and you can look at the many, I think around 400 data layers that are now on the GeoNode. And we've also created and really pushed actually, and we were kind of that squeaky wheel that kept pushing that there would be an Atlantic data community portal through GEOS. That is now open and operating. And thanks to the South African Environmental Observation Network and Pangaea and others, we now have a GEOS All Atlantic Data Community Portal. That's a really nice long-term legacy, and please use it. Go in, search for a species you're interested in, a data set you might be interested in. GEOS will find it and then link you through to the data repository where that information can be found. If I look at the heart of the project now with you all, how did we work with people? iAtlantic was a lucky project in some ways because our timing coincided with a lot of critical policy developments. For instance, the biggest, arguably, change in the management of the high seas, the areas beyond national jurisdiction, was the so-called High Seas Treaty, the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty through the United Nations, which has only just been signed and is currently undergoing ratification. I was able to pull together the first international symposium, bringing all aspects of that treaty negotiation to one place in Edinburgh. I think we had around 500 people attend that meeting, and we now are looking at a second meeting in October of this year, October 2024 in Singapore. So stay tuned for updates on that. It was a huge development, but it will also be a huge amount of work to bring that treaty into force and to share the ratification details with nations around the world. iAtlantic has also worked with OSPAR in the North Atlantic, was present at the UN Oceans conferences. Each one has sent consultation responses and worked with the International Seabed Authority on mining, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and with the Convention on Biological Diversity, notably through the Ecologically and Biologically Significant Marine Areas, or EBSA process. So as you can imagine, a lot of detail behind a slide like this, but our website's full of case studies and stories and information if you're in a policy area and you want to learn more about what we did. Of course, we're a scientific project at heart, so papers and peer review are critical to all our work. We currently have published 114 peer-reviewed papers with 25 submitted and another 34 at least are drafted or in preparation. And I really would highlight the science policy briefs on our website. In fact, here are a few of them, not all of them, but if you click this QR code, it'll take you straight to the science briefs, which have been taken to the United Nations. This one was taken to the International Seabed Authority and was picked up and used. That work was also picked up in the New York Times, elsewhere. It was a really impactful study looking at how very vulnerable the pelagic organisms are, the organisms of the water column, to the plumes of sediment produced by deep sea mining. But at our heart, what we're all about is really this slide, I think. The new generation of scientists and researchers in iAtlantic who learned their skills and made their networks in the iAtlantic family now go forward in their careers. So this has been the most fun part of the project. It always is, but it's also the most important part of the project. So if you meet any young iAtlantic researchers out there, do acknowledge their work. They were heroes and they've done an amazing amount of work for our project over the last 5 years. If you want more details, we've written up a summary of the approach, which I've tried to give you in a few minutes in this talk. It's in Nature Comms. It's a blueprint for integrating scientific approaches and international communities to assess basin-wide ecosystem status. So that paper is freely available online. And if you don't want to read the paper and you prefer a YouTube video, we made a very short video led by our early career scientists on what iAtlantic was all about. So you're very welcome to watch that. Now today's talks are going to run like this. As Valerie said, I've given the overall view of iAtlantic, what the project was about, what we hope to achieve. I'm then going to step in for Maria Paz and talk to you about ocean circulation and ocean observation with a focus really on her work in the South Atlantic. We then move to look at the implications of these changes in terms of implications on fisheries with Angel Perez. And then finally to Daniel Thar, who's going to look at societal implications, economic and nutritional implications of the tropicalisation, the changes in the fish populations that we're seeing off Brazil. And we'll then move to a period of discussion. So thank you very much for that, and I will stop sharing my screen, Valerie, while I bring up the next presentation.
Well, that's already so much information and absolutely amazing, right? Please do use the Q&A. I already see there's 2 questions. That's fantastic. Please do continue putting in your questions there and we will address them at the end.
Thank you, Valerie. I will carry on with Maria Paz's talk. I'm sorry you're hearing my voice again. I would far rather you heard from Maria Paz, but it may be possible Maria Paz will record a video of her presentation, which will have more details and will provide that into the final video from this session. So a lot of the work that Maria Paz wants to talk to you about is based in this paper. It was actually a special issue, the same issue that our iAtlantic paper appeared in from the South Atlantic. And in this paper, Maria talks about energetic overturning flows, dynamic inter-ocean exchanges, and ocean warming observed in the South Atlantic. And so why is this important? Well, the South Atlantic is the only basin with net equatorward heat transport. So it's the only basin that moves that heat around. The South Atlantic connects the AMOC with the other ocean basins. You'll remember my earlier slide was quite a simplified version of this complicated overturning circulation that's driving the warm waters up to the north where they cool and overturn, and then the countercurrents flow back and throughout the Atlantic. So the South Atlantic connects that Atlantic meridional overturning circulation with other ocean basins. You can see here through the South Atlantic, Southern Ocean, and into the Pacific. Both upper and abyssal cells are very prominent in the South Atlantic, and freshwater transport exiting the South Atlantic influences the AMOC bistability. This whole issue of how stable the AMOC is isn't my particular research expertise, but it's one that worries me tremendously, because if we go back through the fossil record, let's say of deep sea corals, we see deep sea corals boom and bust. We think it's probably due to perturbations in AMOC in some places. Why that happened isn't always clear, and if we're very sure it's due to AMOC or not is also uncertain. So that's science, right? Lots of uncertainties, but it seems there's something going on here. It's also clearer and clearer in the literature, as I mentioned before, that very well-respected experts in AMOC stability are increasingly raising the concern that we might see a fundamental change in the overturning circulation of our Atlantic, which has vast implications for global climate and our weather patterns. So AMOC, finally, in the interocean exchanges and climate change drive ocean warming at all depths, drives upper ocean salinification, makes it saltier, and freshens the deep and abyssal ocean. Now, these are parts of our planet that don't normally see much change, but the rates of human climate change, of anthropogenic climate change, are so vast now that we're seeing changes right down into the abyss. And those changes are with us now for generations. There is no doubt about that. So when we look at warming and salinity changes in the South Atlantic, AMOC is driving into ocean changes, climate changes through ocean warming at all depths. And we're seeing the salinification and freshening in the deep and open ocean. You can see some of the graphics from Maria Paz's paper that illustrate these trends at various depths throughout the ocean. The in situ temperatures at the bottom, you can see the general trend running upwards, 0.02 plus or minus 0.01 degrees per decade. And this is normal as well. The data are often very, very variable and noisy. So the year-to-year variability of AMOC strength can be greater than the long-term trend. It makes it very hard to pull these things apart, which is why we need multiple approaches. This is why iAtlantic used foraminiferal records. We used proxies, fossil proxies of AMOC strength, and we combined those with present-day observations from instruments in the water. It's this multidisciplinary approach that has to underpin what we do. Projected AMOC weakening is linked to additional surface, South Atlantic warming and salinification, and that's the underlying driver of some of the changes Angel is going to talk to you about. Abyssal warming in the northern Argentine basin from continuous deep moored observations has also now been seen. So in some ways it's not a surprise, but perhaps it is a surprise about how significant and fast these changes are happening and are going to continue to happen. Which is why, I'll reiterate, it's so important to put moorings, right, instrumentation into the ocean to observe what's going on. And we have to sustain those observations now. So here's one example. I showed you the black lines on my earlier graphs, but this is showing you in green where the Samba West instrumentation is positioned, and then that line extends across the Samba array 34.5 degrees south to the tip of South Africa, the South Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation Basin-wide Array. In the Samba West, we've looked at the Brazil Current, the Deep Western Boundary Current, and abyssal flows. What do we actually do? Well, here are some of the results from Maria Paz, and I really would point you to her paper to look at the details here. But it updates a 13-year-long record of the Brazil Current from 2009 to 2022. Maria Paz is working on this at the moment. She's seeing large fluctuations of up to 20 spherops in short periods of just 2 to 3 weeks. No significant seasonal cycle, interannual variability, or trend. So again, you're seeing lots of variance, lots of challenges. So what are we doing to now try and make these data as useful as we can for the future? Well, for instance, we're adding sensors both in the North Atlantic through Atlas and now in the South Atlantic to increase the biological relevance. That meant, in simple terms, adding oxygen to the story. Not just temperature, current speed and direction and salinity, but also let's look at oxygen. So we bought and paid for oxygen sensors to be deployed in the South Atlantic. iAtlantic resourced this mooring here. It's a short mooring called the iAtlantic IA mooring, and that our friends at TriAtlas paid for a tall mooring. TriAtlas was very much dominated by physical oceanography, and they put a tall mooring in, and we added oxygen sensors to these. So the tall mooring deployed in December 2022 was in collaboration with TriAtlas. And our mooring in the Brazil Current at 700 meters is also now in place, and we're looking forward to seeing some of the results coming through. The expedition to recover the instruments is slightly delayed. So this new tall mooring is essential, looking at essential properties and ocean currents throughout the water column, but critically it enhances the capacity to make these measurements over time in a critical region of our global ocean. So to summarize, on behalf of Maria Paz, we've seen density and pressure gradients, wind, eddies, boundary currents, and inter-ocean exchanges driving an energetic circulation in the subtropical and tropical South Atlantic Ocean. It's a key area of the global ocean to better understand. As a result of the excess heat absorbed from the atmosphere associated with ongoing global warming, AMOC variability, inter-ocean exchange from the Pacific and Indian basins, and climate changes, the South Atlantic has warmed from the surface to the deep. The upper ocean, South Atlantic salinity has increased. It's now a saltier ocean, while intermediate, deep and abyssal water masses are freshening. Slightly counterintuitive, but there you are. The upper ocean is becoming saltier, the deeper and abyssal water masses are freshening. We continue to observe these water mass changes, their causes, and large-scale regional impacts on heat content, sea level, extreme weather, climate, ecosystems, and fisheries. So all of that has a huge priority for continued research in the South Atlantic. And that's why today I'm so happy that Angel and Daniel are with us to talk about how that work's evolved in iAtlantic, and we'll learn about how I hope it will go forward into the future. We've enhanced the monitoring capacities in the South Atlantic with the moorings that I've talked to you about to observe in tandem ocean currents and physical and biogeochemical properties, particularly noting that dissolved oxygen story we'll now be able to have for the first time. And how ecosystem relevant is that? If we don't know the oxygen levels, it really is pretty basic, the biological monitoring of much of the ocean. So really important, I think, we expand the biological relevance of oceanographic monitoring around the world. So thank you very much to Maria Paz for those slides, and please do check her paper. I know Maria Paz would love to hear from you if you have any specific questions. Thank you. I think maybe
Hi, Angel.
Angel, we can move straight to you.
Yes, go ahead. Please do.
Okay.
Yeah. Angel is coming to us from Brazil, by the way, as is Danielle. So, yeah. Go ahead, Angel.
Can you all see my presentation?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for having us in the organizer, for having us in the Air Center Fridays. I will talk about some of the results of studies that myself and my partner in the laboratory in south of Brazil, Rodrigo Santana, have conducted in recent years in the context of the iAtlantic project, that basically they try to show some modifications in biological communities and fisheries that we can attribute to impacts of climate shifts in a specific process that we have called the tropicalization of the subtropical area. So I would like to conduct you through 4 essential points. First, that the ocean warming is causing the tropicalization of subtropical regions. Then that we can observe how communities are changing as a consequence of this tropicalization, looking at multi-species catch records. Then I'll share you some results on how the Mersenne pelagic communities are changing in the Southwest Atlantic and how we can explain that changes. And finally, we ask if these changes are signs that we're going into some sort of ecosystem tipping point. So we heard that the ocean is getting warmer because it's absorbing a lot of the heat of the atmosphere, excessive heat in the past 100 years. And it's come to about 0.8 degrees Celsius increase by now. But important things is that, as we have seen, this temperature change is not homogeneous across the oceans. It is affected by the circulation patterns of the major process of circulation in the oceans that are affected also by climate changes. And what it does is that there are some areas that we have seen in the previous presentations that end up getting warmer faster than other areas in the world. And these regions have been called the marine hotspots. And as Maria Paz has shown in her studies, the Southwest Atlantic is a major marine hotspot. It's basically the result of fluctuations or modifications in the circulation patterns of the South Atlantic subtropical gyre, and particularly the western limb, as we have seen before, where the Brazil current, which is the west boundary current, transports warm and tropical waters from north to south until it reaches another current that flows in the opposite direction, the Malvinas currents that transports subantarctic waters. And the point where they encounter about 40 degrees south, there's the formation of what we call the subtropical confluence. And that is that region is responsible for most of the environmental variability in the coastal areas of southern Brazil, Uruguay, and northern Argentina. So as we have seen in the recent years, there have been changes in the wind patterns in the South Atlantic because of the global warming that had intensified the circulation and transport of the Brazil current. And as a result, the current is reaching more and more higher latitudes, pushing the subtropical confluence towards the south and increasing its influence along the areas of southern Brazil, Uruguay, and northern Argentina, which will then forming what we call a major hotspots, and we expect that having some important consequences for the ecosystems in the region. So I show you here some of these figures from the paper from Ltda and collaborators in 2019, where you can see the heat flux increasing in this region, but also you can see surface temperature anomalies very high in this region. And I enclose this in this box that sort of delimits what we call the subtropical area of the South Atlantic. And what are the consequences of that for fauna? Well, the subtropical areas are characterized by a transition fauna zone where tropical species or subtropical species reach their polar world limits, whereas the cold water species or temperate species reach their equator world limits. So this is basically a transition area where there's mixture of cold water and warm water species, which as it gets warmer, we expect that basically we get a poleward expansion of tropical and subtropical species, sort of invasive warm water species in the area, and the poleward retraction of warm temperate species towards the pole. So to a point where we might get a new scenario that's fully dominated by tropical or subtropical species, which will be then a subtropical area becoming tropical, or as we mentioned, a tropicalized area. So in order to observe these changes, we have to have a time series of observations on marine communities in the area, which are very difficult to find in the Southwest Atlantic. But we have found an opportunity looking at fisheries, because fisheries in the area have developed based exactly on this diversity of fauna. And these are multi-species fisheries, which are relied on the combinations of species that some part of them are cold water species, part of them are warm water species. And as we can see a environment that is changing towards a tropicalized scenario, we would expect that these catches will become more representative of warm water species, and we find some losses of biomass of cold water species in the area. So we decided to look into that direction, and that takes us to my second point, is that looking at this fishing data, we could sort of explore what will be happening in the demersal and pelagic communities in the Southwest Atlantic. And we've done so by reproducing a methodology described by William Chang from University of British Columbia and his colleagues in 2013 that considers the species compositions of catch throughout time and mean temperature preferences of these species. And you can find in this in his contributions a very extensive list of species mean temperature preferences that are basically estimated from the species distribution and sea surface temperature maps. And there are other sources of you can find this species temperature preferences. And then the first thing we did was calculate an overall mean for all data sets and classified species in warm water affinity if their preferences are above that mean, and cold water affinity if the species are below that mean. Now, the next step was to calculate what has been called the mean temperature of the catch, which is basically an average of the temperature preferences of the species in the catch weighted by their catch. And this is an index. When it increases, it's telling us that are you getting either more abundant catches of warm water species, or you're getting less abundant catches of cold water species, or you're having both situations going on in your catches. So you can follow the variability of MTC and try to interpret what's happening in the ecosystem. Apart from doing that, we also try to explain what is controlling the MTC series, and we tested the effects of sea temperature, either sea surface temperature and sea bottom temperature, and this has been extracted from an ocean model that was developed within the context of the iAtlantic that's called 20 for the South Atlantic. So we used 3 databases. 2 of them were referred to this red box here that you can see here. We call this the Brazilian meridional margin. and they refer to demersal fisheries and small pelagic fisheries. So this database is maintained by University of Itajaí, where we work, and it's enclosed in the period of 2000, run from 2000 to 2019, and includes 78 species of demersal fisheries, which accounts for 80% of the total catch, and 31 species of the small pelagic fisheries, which account for more than 90% of the total catch. And we also considered a third database that includes the oceanic fisheries of large pelagic fish, and that considers a database that's maintained by ICAT, the International Council for Conservation of Atlantic Tuna, and it includes 29 species that account for more than 95% of the total biomass landed, and a much longer period from 1978 to 1978 to 2018. So what have we learned by looking at the MTC of these three databases? Well, we have here first the anomalies of MTC variation throughout 20 years of both the demersal fisheries and small pelagic fisheries in the Brazilian meridional margin. What you can see in the first case, these are the white dots lines here. We can see there's most of the time series there's a certain stability, fluctuating around the mean, but at the end of the time series there's a very sharp increase on MTC. If you consider the entire data time period, the entire data series, there is a significant increase in the mean temperature of the catch. That's about 0.6 degrees Celsius per year, and that variability is well explained by sea bottom temperature, both with no period lags and 1 year lag. And we also calculate the very sharp increase for about after 2013, with an increasing rate of 0.4 degrees Celsius per year. And we look at the series of the small pelagics. The series is very similar. We can see also a stability period throughout most of the time, but again, towards the end of the series, there's a very sharp increase in MTC. You can see this by the dashed line here. And considering the entire period, there is a significant increase again of MTC of a lower rate, 0.03 degrees Celsius per year. But that increase is also explained by sea surface, in this case, a sea surface temperature, both with no lags and with 1 year lag. And again, we can see this increase in the last part of the series, but we didn't have the calculating how much is that, but we can see that's much faster than it used to be in the rest of the series. And finally, we get the series that we observe, the longer series for the large pelagic fisheries. It also has a signal for increasing MTC, and that's significant, but a much lower rate, 0.12 degrees Celsius per year. And is also explained by sea surface temperature, but in this case, this explanation, we need to add a 2 years lag or a 4 years lag to see a significant explanation. So we conclude here that we might find a strong signal in the trend shift in the demersal fisheries, a kind of a moderate signal, and also with the trend shift in the small pelagic series, and weak signal, although significant, with no trend shifts for the large pelagics. So our next step here was to look into the changes in the composition of species in the fisheries, and this is the data for demersal fisheries, where we use multivariate analysis to see how the composition of species in the catches will change throughout time. And what we can see here in the PCOA is that we get the distribution of years in a sort of a temporal sequence. G1 refers to the first years of the series, and G4 are the last years of the series. And you can see how catches have moved from an initial scenario where we have a mixture of species with cold water and warm preferences. And in the late scenarios, in G4, there is a much lower number of species that are representing those years, and most of them are the species that have preferences for warm waters. When you calculate gains and loss of biomass, contrasting these two periods, the early years and the late years, we can see that most of the gains are attributed to species with warm water affinities, such as the white-mouthed croaker, the spotted pink shrimp, and the great triggerfish. And of course, most of the losses that we got in that period are attributed to species that have preferences for cold water, such as Argentine croaker, the Argentine hake, and codling. And that tells us that we can see at least in the demersal community, a clear sign that communities are changing towards a reaction for a tropicalized scenario. And this has been published in Communication of Earth and Environment 2022. Like we also did the same analysis for the other data sets, and I'm just showing here the balances of biomass in the early, contrasting the early years with the later years. And you can see again on the side of the gains of biomass, again, a pattern that most of these gains are attributed to species that have preferences for warm water, such as Atlantic bumper and Atlantic thread herring among the small pelagics, and what we call the tropical tuna, the skipjack tuna and big-eye tuna in the case of the large pelagic fisheries. But when you look at losses, when you look at the small pelagics, we see an important pattern of losses of one species that is a warm water species, with the Brazilian sardine. And that's very intriguing because this is a major, this is the most important target of these fisheries, is probably the most important fishing resource in Brazil. It's very abundant compared to others. We've seen a major loss in the period, and we have to try to understand if this is related to environmental changes or if these are related to other different processes. But when we look at the large oceanic fish, again, all the losses, there are not a lot of losses in biomass in contrasting these two periods, but they are related to one species, one temperate species, that's the albacore. So that's coherent with the tropicalization scenario. So what we see in the pelagic fishes is that we also see responses that we can relate to tropicalization, but these responses are somewhat different from those that we are seeing in the demersal community. And that leads us to the last point, where we try to ask if these changes that we are seeing can be related to, some sort of transition towards a tipping point. So we would have an original scenario, which is the typical subtropical region where there are mixture of cold water and warm water species, and where the fishery is based on or relies on. And this system is being forced by the expansion of the Brazil current, the polar retraction of subtropical confluence, and of the overall marine warming in the region, to another scenario, an alternative scenario, which be a tropicalized region where the warm water species or tropical, subtropical species dominate. So we are probably going through, we think that we are going through some sort of transition at this point. We just don't know if this transition is reversible or if we are indeed moving to some sort of tipping point or a new stable state. So we are starting to look at it. Is this a working situations, which is a work in progress, and we are using indicators that of early warning signals to tipping points. We're basically using two very simple statistics: the autocorrelation at lag 1 and the standard deviations of the series. And that these indicators they would increase if a system is starting to have difficulties to go back to the original state once it's disturbed. So the more they increase, the more the system is losing resilience and is moving into another alternative state. So we use that in two different approaches. One is the rolling windows, where we define a window and we move this window along the time series, calculating these indicators. And the others is basically the same, except that we fix the window and just expand gradually the number of years that we include within the window. So what we have seen, this is for the demersal fisheries, is that basically in the last years of the season, we have this sharp increase in both indicators that tells us that we are probably approaching some early warning signal, that signals us some approaching some tipping point. We do see the same results in the small pelagic series, but we don't see these results in the large pelagic series. So just to conclude, I would say that the very simple terms, that we have clear signs of tropicalization of fauna from looking at catch composition temporal patterns. These changes are related to ocean warming, which is provoked by the increased dynamics of the Brazil current and is induced by climate change. These signs are stronger in demersal communities and are weaker in pelagic communities. So different parts of the biota seems to be responded differently to these environmental changes. And on the Brazilian meridional margin, at least, there seems to be early warning signals of approaching a tipping point. And of course, the next question is what are the social and economical consequences? Because one thing about using the MTC approach is that at the same time, you're looking at the community, the natural community modifications, but you're also looking at fisheries. So we have these two responses at the same time. And this the MTC data series can tell us more about what are the consequences for fisheries and all the benefits that fisheries produce for the society. So, but that is what we're going to hear in the next presentation by Ltda. And I'll just stop here and say thank you to many people that have helped us in this analysis. Scientists from working package 2 and 3 that provided the oceanographic variables data, and also the time series analysis group. And of course, our data providers that include many, ICAT, Univali, Petrobras, the Ministry of Fisheries in Brazil, and the providers of funds that included the European Union and the local foundation for science in the state of Santa Catarina. Of course, a lot of this, what you've seen in this presentation, was part of the PhD thesis of an early career, Rodrigo Santana, in our lab. And that's that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angel. Over to you, Daniel.
All right. Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, Angel. And thank you, Murray. It's a great honor to be here and to be able to pick up from where Angel left. Well, let me share the slides. Okay, so as Angel said, there is strong evidence that the demersal fish communities are changing due to climate change in the West South Atlantic. And what I'm going to talk to you about is the consequences of that warming for food security. And I'll be focusing on the industrial bottom fisheries in the Brazilian meridional margin, which is the Southwest Atlantic. And that that's part of the working package 3 of iAtlantic. Well, just to give you a sense of where we are, this Brazilian meridional margin encompasses 5 Brazilian states. There's an industrial fleet of around 600 boats that operate in this area, with a combined effort of over 30,000 days of fishing per year. And you can see on this left side panel where the red squares show you where fishing is more intense, but the whole region is very well fished. And it brought in 2018, which is the most consistent year with a complete database from the landings on this region. It brought 32,000 tons, which is 67% of all demersal catch. The remaining is due to artisanal fisheries that operate near the coast. And as Angel showed, it's a multi-strategy and multi-species fleet. And so there's 4 main methods of fishing: bottom pair trawl, which is responsible for most of the catches, double rig, bottom gill net. So you have some pictures so you can see what it looks like. But the interesting aspect of these fishing fleets is that they share many of the fishes. They share these resources, and 35% of the 78 demersal species can be caught by either of these fleets. So it's a very interesting setting where you have changes in the catch capability of one fleet does not necessarily lead to that species not being caught by another fleet. So that's just to set the scene. But we know that, well, tropicalization is already on. Angel showed that there is no chance of the present result of the fisheries being the same as the past. So we can compare them. And as Angel already showed, there is a clear sign of tropicalization where we have, well, a net loss of around 10%. These two periods will be compared. So the past is like 20 years ago, and then the present. And between these time frames, we can see these shifts where one species gain a lot, but all the other species that are that have their affinity with hot water, with warmer waters, they diminished in the catch. While on the other hand, species that are I'm sorry, I just changed the order. These are all species associated with cold water, and they diminished, while species associated with hot water have increased, especially the prawns, hot water prawns, and we'll see that this changed a lot of well, later on we'll see the effects of this. Okay, so these species have changed already. We see a sort of a 10% decrease in overall catches. The fleet performance and bycatch that they bring also changed. We see some modification, some losing, some gaining. Overall, we have that 10% reduction. And we also have an overall decrease in bycatch because the bottom gillnet, which is the art of fishing that gained, is a little bit more selective than the rest. So it's not necessarily a bad deal at the present moment. And when we see the revenue of fishers and fishmongers, we also see that these changes did not represent much. For instance, if we compare the past and the present, we see a very stable revenue for the fishers. So they didn't feel this change happening. And this is where the prawn comes in. It represents nowadays 27% of total revenue because it increased the volume too much. And this is the shrimp that has a warm water affinity. And if we look at the fish prices being sold at the largest supply center in South America, called CEAGESP in São Paulo, we see that the average weighted price actually increased slightly. So everyone seems to be happy and did not feel that this reshuffling of species brought any consequences, right? However, there was a deep fall in the supply of protein for consumers. If we look now, this graph shows the content of the protein content of that fish, of those fisheries. That is a result of the carcass yield of each species and the protein content that they have. So we see a 9% drop in the total amount of protein offered by these South Brazilian fisheries to the markets. Interesting, not a huge drop, obviously, but, and we know that proteins are found in other meat as well. So how to judge the consequences in affordability and nutritional consequences? Well, first, we have to check the catch's market prices. And for that, we get that all those 78 species, and we break them down into 5 types of fish according to their retail price. What we call the high-end fish, 10 species that fetch a higher price. Medium fish, which is fish that are sold at a medium price. And cheap fish, which accounts for most of the species, and they are sold for a very cheap price. And then we have shrimps and squids and octopuses. And when we look at the market price, again, at this from this CEAGESP, the biggest trading in fish in Brazil, we roughly see that the prices remain more or less stable. Of course, there's a bit of inflation, but we see them bundled up here on the bottom, a whole lot of species that sell for a bargain. And we see also high-end fish selling for a price, right? So with this information in mind, we can compare the prices of the fish to other meat options. And this is what Brazil's average meat consumption pattern is, right? From OECD 2023, publication along with the FAO. And it shows that, well, chicken is the meat that is consumed the most, nearly 50%, with beef, pigs, and fish accounting for around 8% of the total. Well, looking at their average prices, we can calculate an average meat price without fish, right? Because in the case that we do not have fish, or we have a variable in stream of fish, we have to look at alternatives, all right? So this is the average meat price in Brazil without fish. And with that, we can compare to those 5 types of fish before that we land from demersal fisheries. And we clearly see that whoever relies on the cheap fish is having a loss because it's having to purchase higher priced meat. Whoever is on consuming the high end or the medium priced fish won't have welfare losses in this case because, well, whatever they have, whatever their choices are, they are more affordable, right? They can afford that, but that doesn't happen with people that rely on the cheap fish. So if we look at these differences from the past and the present, we see that the average price went up, and that creates a smaller difference for the average price of meat. And if we times that with the quantity of edible protein that is supplied with from the fisheries, we have, well, first we have a nice information here that we're adding 127 million in terms of affordable meat, but that is smaller than what happened in the past due to climate change. So in the end, we have a 5 million welfare loss to society in terms of the changes that happen in the past and the present due to climate change. It's not a lot, but we see that there are other consequences. One of them is, another of them is the supply of essential micronutrients, because fish is not only a cheap source of meat, but is also a highly nutritional source of meat. So we went fishing for data because this data is not very easy to find or very encompassing. So we sampled 37 species on our lab for their protein content and their edible portion, right? Fractioning fillets and all the meat from the carcass in order to have that. And for the remaining 41 species, we relied on data from FAO to complement the edible portions. And we found two very interesting databases for micronutrients. For invertebrates, we relied on a database from FAO, which is called FAO Infoods, and an excellent and quite recent database created by Hicks et al., and it's being updated. It's called Fish-Based Nutrients. And Hicks et al. Developed a Bayesian model to assess micronutrients for fish out of sample. So from a smaller sample of micronutrients from some species, this model can derive micronutrients for a whole lot of other species, relying on how similar they are in terms of habitats, in terms of what they feed on, in terms of size, and where they live in the ocean. And so it's a very interesting database, which allowed us to compose a database with complete information for all of the 78 species that are fished in the Brazilian meridional margin. And that enabled us to calculate the weighted average nutritional composition from bottom fisheries. So we see here not only protein content, but also calcium, iron, selenium, zinc, omega-3, and vitamin A. So six micronutrients from fish. And well, that's very interesting. we saw that there is a change from the composition of the past to the present due to climate change. But what do we do with these numbers, right? Well, let's check the social surplus that they provide. So we looked at price quotes for supplements, dairy supplements for these specific nutrients. And with this unitary price and also always checking the cheapest alternatives, we created a price quotes for these nutrients per grams or per milligrams. And we are able to calculate the nutritional value of bottom fish in terms of a serving of 100 grams. So when we buy 100 grams of fish from our fisheries here, the demersal fisheries, we are getting a 1.38 reais of benefits in terms of these micronutrients that they have. And with these figures in hand, we can calculate we can calculate and compare this value to the nutrient composition from the average meat, right? So the average meat without fish in Brazil has this nutritional composition, and we see clearly that omega-3 is a very big differential for fish, which we already knew, but now we can show by how much it's different. And if we times this composition of the average meat on a serving of 100 grams with those same values that we use for the fish, the same prices, we get the average nutritional value for the alternative meat. And we come to the quick conclusion that our grandmothers were always right, telling us to eat fish because they're good for you. And indeed, they are good for us. Fish is very nutritious. And by noticing how much this difference is, we can compare them and see if we had any welfare loss due to climate change. And just on a note here, protein won't be accounted for because it's way too much similar among meats. So it's trading fish for other meats in terms of their protein content doesn't change much, but it does change for other micronutrients. So we can calculate what the bottom fisheries provide in terms of nutritional surplus. And we see that the values are very big, especially when we compare them to the wholesale value, and we see that we are getting around 80% of the value that they're being sold for in terms of nutrition. So here, all those nutritional tables are compiled for each type of fish, and this is the value that they represent, and we have to subtract what the average meat presents for us in terms of value for the same proteins and micronutrients to derive the fisheries social surplus to society. So when we purchase a cheap fish from our fisheries, instead of purchasing an alternative meat, we are getting a surplus of 183 million reais, right? And we can also calculate the change that climate change imposed on these fisheries. And we see that in terms of cheap fish, it actually went up, but it produced a loss for other types. Overall, there is a reduction in 5.4 million, which is another welfare loss to society. Not a huge one again, but again, we're not comparing, we're not projecting this into the future. We are looking at what already happened 20 years ago for the present. And that's attributable to climate change, as Angel showed us. So going forward, we can assess the threat of further tropicalization because we know that will happen. We're not so sure about by how much or how rapid things will change, but we know it will continue to change. And unfortunately, will continue to change for the worse because the temperatures are increasing and they will keep increasing. And that will lead to further tropicalization. And as Angel put it very clearly, we are probably reaching some tipping points which could anticipate some changes that we are forecasting for the future. So Santana forecasted the mean temperature of the catch for the 78 species under climate change. And this is what the MTC looks like. It gets a lot worse under the no abatement scenario for the emissions. And he also calculated the probability of occurrence of these species. And by the end of the century, only 26 to 30 of those 78 most common species will likely remain. So some of them will not be available to be caught in our waters. And more recently, we find two very interesting publications that also show the threat of further tropicalization. One of them is Boyce et al. From 2020, and they calculate for the South Atlantic a probable decrease in 7% in fish landings. This for overall, including pelagics, which will suffer less than the bottom fish. So it's a conservative estimate. And there is another article in a preprint from Boot et al., very recent, from last month, that shows the cumulative effect of a weakening AMOC on top of climate change. And for the South Atlantic, they predict at least a 3% cumulative impact in terms of fish landings. So we can have, and this is, mind you, this is a work in progress. We're going to model these effects with a more refined view in the future. But for now, let's just do a quick supposition, and let's suppose that the biomass reduction will be of 10% from the current catch levels, and let's also suppose that those species that are out of range will indeed occur, but will occur only at 50% the present rate. So with these two very simple assumptions, and that's not modeling again, it's work in progress, but just to give you a sense of where we can, where are we going in terms of a conservative estimate of the losses, we're talking about a 22 to a 28% reduction in the future catches. Of course, that will reshuffle the species as well. So if we take those simple calculations forward in terms of the value that they provide to society in terms of affordability, nutrition, which are the micronutrients, and of course the willingness to pay for consumers to buy these fish because there is a market for them, and that ability to purchase fish will be hindered by the smaller landings. We can calculate all these reductions in welfare, and this table here shows you all the figures that I have already shown, which are from a comparison from the past to the present. Now, looking forward, for the present to the future, under a smaller change scenario and a greater scenario with greater changes, well, with greater warming, we see all negative, unfortunately, negative and red numbers. And the compound amount that society can lose due to climate change from our fisheries is very big, very significant, and it goes over the 180, 190 million figure, and that is for a representative year, and we have to think that this occurs year after year. So we're in for losses, and we can and that will affect affordability, and that will affect well, the nutrition aspect of the fishery. So there's great consequences from climate change. And well, going on to my last slide, and this is, well, this is a question. Can fisheries management contain the projected losses? That's something we'll have to look after. We don't know for sure, but we know there is potential for that, because currently we are fishing under, we're not fishing our sustainably, and we're not fishing what the biomass could supply if we were fishing sustainably and well managed. So if we fished at 80% the maximum sustainable yield, we could already be fishing 57,000 tons instead of the current 32,000 tons. So that shows you that we have scope for getting management right. But we also see that some key species are already being overfished or are at a biological insecurity state. One of them, and this is very important, is the one that is responsible for 55% of the landings, and it's one of the species that will remain. So we have to treat it better if we're going to rely on it with further warming. So from the 38 evaluated stocks, not all the 78 fishes were evaluated, but from 38 evaluated, 5 are at biologically safety levels, and 33 of them have their biomasses lower than they should be. So we know there is scope for management, but we hope that these figures will be a wake-up call for them to adjust it quicker than they are already adjusting. Well, that was it. Looking forward for the question and answers, and thank you very much. And also thank you for other co-authors and also people that contributed to this study, and also the data providers and enabled us to make all these calculations. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to all of our speakers. What rich presentations and so full of information. I think each presentation really deserved probably just an hour alone for themselves, because there was so much data in there. I've noted down a few of my own questions, and I see we already have at least 10 questions from the audience, so perhaps we'll start with that. Let me just pull those up really quickly. So thank you for those of you who have already started answering the questions, but I will read them out even though they have been answered, because we do have a lot of people that attend these webinars after the fact. So we do like to have everything recorded on the video. So I'll just start off with a question from Colin Smith, who it says, thanks a lot, Dr. Roberts. So he understood the project ended, but he asks, where are all the legacy data and information hosted for future reference? And that's for you, Marie.
Okay, yes. So I typed an answer in. The data sets, the exact repository depends on the sort of data. So if it's genetic data, it's with a genetic database, GenBank, for instance, or the European Nucleotide Archive. If it's an environmental data set, it might rest with Pangaea if it's in Europe, or the South African Environmental Observation Network if it's from South Africa. And that's where GEOS comes in, because GEOS is like an umbrella. It finds the data. It doesn't hold the data, but it shows you where the data are, and you go find them. So you can search the GEOS portal. We also had sort of specialist layers in geographic information system type layers, which go into a thing called a GeoNode, an online geographic information system, and I put a link into my answer direct to that. They're all linked from the website, so they're very easy to find. The other thing that I put into some of my answers is a link to our results summary document. It's a highlight summary document produced over the last 6 months or so. And it's high level, so the details aren't all there, but you can go from there to easily find all the details and right through to the source publications and project deliverables.
Thank you. Now I'll move on then to the next question. So from Carlos Garcia, he mentions the iAtlantic project is fascinating. Are there any plans for any iAtlantic 2 under the Aoria Declaration? Could you provide more details on its results and achievements, namely the ones published in your research highlight report?
So specifically to the point of iAtlantic 2, we're not moving forward with, if you like, an iAtlantic 2, but we did effectively do that over the last decade from the Atlas program in the North Atlantic, lessons learned and the approach to allow us to then move to a full ocean basin scale. So from the Galway Statement that was signed in 2013, projects initiated in 2016, through to the Belém Statement signed in 2017, projects initiated in 2019. So in a sense, that has kind of happened. We're not doing an iAtlantic 2, but many of our team, our early career researchers, but also some of the older researchers, are busy working forward in other programs, local projects, European projects, taking the lessons learned and some of the research move forward. But it is a shame to lose, in a sense, what we have, which is a very functional, dynamic community of practitioners that are all working together across really diverse economies and scientific and social science and economic, as you've heard, knowledge bases. We'll stay in touch, but we don't have the funded program of research as things stand. And then the other question, I think, was a little bit of detail on the highlights report. So yes, it's quite a simple report that flows through the overall objectives of the project and gives you highlight results from each section. So I think it stands alone, actually, the report, quite well, but it'll lead you into, as I said, all of the details. And as you know, it gets quite detailed quite quickly, so we felt it really important to have a highlights document, but also highlights videos, which I think should be understandable to anyone who's just even got a vague interest. They're deliberately non-technical, non-specialist. And we hope they're nice. Some of the visuals we have from the deep ocean, I mean, I'm really proud of. They're absolutely beautiful.
Thank you. Yes, if anybody has any like 10 or 50 million euros laying about that they want to give to the scientists to carry on that scientific observations, that would be amazing. So moving on to Teresa Crawford. Again, she says fantastic presentations, and this is again a question for Dr. Marie. How does the AMOC specifically affect the Caribbean's weather and climate? What can we expect in the near future? What are the long-term scenarios, namely in term of biodiversity?
This is a hard question to answer, and I'll throw it open to my other panelists to have a think about this as well, if you have any insights. I would like to check literature on this before I would dare go into any detail, to be honest. But my sense is that what we see with these massive changes is greater uncertainty, greater variability, and as we know, kind of the more pressing issue for the Caribbean might be the increased intensity of storm events. Now, those don't all directly relate to AMOC specifically, but they absolutely relate to warming and the huge amount of heat energy now stored in the ocean, which could promote and enhance the risk of hurricanes. But Daniel or Angel, do you have thoughts on that particular question?
Well, not very specific, but as you focus on areas that are tropical or already warm, traditionally or historically warm, the effects that I have shown, the tropicalization, that are more intense. The areas that are tropical are getting more and more warm, and the species have nowhere to go. So they cannot change that. So we expect to have even more harsh impacts on communities in the tropical areas than in the subtropical areas, where we just have a replacement of species. So that's what I can tell about these tropical areas.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and moving on to a somewhat similar question, but a different area. So Claudia Almeida asks, what impact will changes in the AMOC have on the Benguela current, namely in Angola coast?
And again, my answer is somewhat similar in that I'm not expert on that region. I'd be a bit hesitant to give anything very specific. Now, it might be, Angel, what do you think, that some similar processes are very likely occurring?
Yes, well, not really. We have, as part of our work, I didn't show it here, but we did explore some of the data of the big tunas from the eastern Atlantic. And we do get very, very weak signals compared to the western side. So somehow these changes are not that intense. Environmental changes are not that intense on the eastern side compared to the western side. Now, I really don't know exactly why, but that's what it seems when we look at the biological data, at least the biological that we have in hand. But again, this is just one small piece of information.
And could it be due to the upwelling, the big picture upwelling of cooler waters that are basically muting that effect?
Yes, well, when we see about the increase of Brazil transport, it seems that some scientists see that it starts with the increase in dynamics of the south tropical current, south equatorial current towards the north, and it's sort of, if you remember the subtropical gyre, it goes from the southeast to the northwest. South Atlantic, and of course that intensification of the transport of the South Equatorial bifurcates of Brazil and forms the Brazil current. So that system is actually having a consequence on the western side. But on the eastern side, we have the Benguela current, and there's the Angola basin circulation, which apparently works a little different from this major circulation system. So maybe that's why we'll have more complex changes in these areas than we find in the western sides. But again, we have to look more in depth into that, in that area specifically.
And this is where, follow-on projects, Valerie, if they take some of the lessons learned and the approach that we've developed in iAtlantic, like this, we didn't go into the detail of it, there wasn't time, but the unified statistical analysis workflow that our work package 3 developed, the time series analysis, was advised by one of the best ecological statisticians alive today. And it's a really useful output that I'd encourage anyone who's interested to take a look at, because that gives us a framework to take in diverse data sets and look for these kinds of trends, and then start asking the questions. If the ecology is showing us something, sometimes the biology has told us all we need to know, and then we work out the physical reasons for it later, but we need to make the most profit of the information that we have.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for that. I was wondering how much the science that you've collected has been going to more like land, connecting to the land and what's happening to the impacts on land, and to even agricultural and other human activity practices on coastal regions. I mean, I'm hoping that's being taken up as well.
Angela or Daniel, I don't know if you want to come in on this one. We are very much a deep and open ocean, so we're really quite offset. We have very few immediate connections to land, so we're a little isolated from that. But clearly there are, no region of our planet is immune from the effects of what we've done with fossil fuels, so that transcends all boundaries. We're acutely aware, for instance, of the spread of the giant sargassum belt. I've seen it with my own eyes here in Mexico, but I'm also involved in the Sargasso Sea Commission. And just as an interesting aside, I mean, sargassum is a wonderful thing in the right place, doing the right thing. The sargassum belts around Bermuda and the Sargasso Sea are a hugely important ecosystem, a very precious high seas ecosystem that we need to look after. But we see the consequences of when things run out of kilter, as we say in English, they get out of balance, and the sargassum blooms and proliferates across the Atlantic and now inundates beaches throughout the Caribbean, and it becomes a really huge problem. My understanding is the reasons for that are a little uncertain. I think there's a lot of new papers on this, but one of the explanations I've seen written about it does relate to nutrient pollution from rivers. But I'm not, again, this I don't think is absolutely clearly worked out yet. Danielle or Angel, any thoughts on your side on terrestrial impacts? I mean, Daniel's work very neatly points the relevance to society, implications, back to people.
Yep. And there's another consequence that happens on land that affects fisheries, but does not affect industrial fisheries too much, because these are the fleets that go offshore to fish, right? They harvest fish on open waters, but the artisanal fish, which is fisheries that are responsible for a significant part of the catch as well, and are very important because of their socioeconomic prospects. I mean, many artisanal fishers would have a hard time finding job elsewhere, and they like a lot what they do, and it's important for their community. And they are affected by rain as well, because we know that climate change is making rainfall here in South Brazil more intense, and not so much evenly distributed as it was, and that influences the output of rivers, and that changes salinity, and also changes the I don't know how to say the technical word, but it changes for example, there is a shrimp that doesn't like this movement too much, right? So it's probably going, the higher salinity is better for that shrimp. So when we have lots of rainfall falling, more this influx of not saline water, fresh water, will probably have an effect on the recruitment of that shrimp. So, but we just don't know it's by how much, but we know that that effect happens, and it will probably get worse. That's what we know by now.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just complimenting that in fact we were looking at this community change with just one aspect of the effects of environmental changes. in the sea. As Daniel said, on the coastal zones, we can expect that all these communities will suffer from the increase of the sea level, because that will threaten the places where they live and fish, and the intensification of storms that already are in our region having a good effect on the artisanal fisheries, because they have small boats. So at this point, they cannot use that. They cannot fish as they used to do, because of the weather is really different from it used to be many years ago. So yes, when we look at consequences of changing the climate to fisheries, we have to include a lot of different aspects to see how much it will really affect the activity.
Angela, something that you mentioned about the sardines, that the loss of sardines, and so this is really a critical keystone species in a sense, because so much is based, on sardines. I know you said you didn't really have an idea for why the loss was happening, but can you venture a hypothesis yet, or any ideas?
Yeah, well, it's this is as you say, it's a very important species, and there are data that relates that to the fishing activity, or being overfished or for so many times. So, but it's a very short-lived species that fluctuates enormously from one year to another. And so we are used to see these changes. And what I said is that I really have to go into the data to try to sort out if this is an oscillation of population, which has something to do with climate, or if this is just basically overfishing situation, So, of course, when you use the technique, we use the MTC, we might have other factors affecting the signals that we get from the AMTC. And that's what we have to try to be more specific and try to make sure that other aspects of the fishing industry are not affecting the signals we're getting and interpreting as a climate change situation. So that's what I think that sardine deserves a better attention. This was the first analysis, but we have to understand that. But most likely it's a problem of overfishing scenario.
Thank you. And just one other question for Daniel. So I take it that your studies are primarily wild-caught fisheries, correct, and not aquaculture. But are you also thinking of doing a similar study on aquaculture in that region, just to compare against any possible future losses or net gains?
To be honest, no. But I'll give it a thought. But we don't have that much aquaculture at sea here in Brazil. We do have aquaculture at sea, but it's mostly focused on mollusks and not on fish.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
But maybe perhaps what is already happening all the world over and also here is that some freshwater species are being farmed, and that is compensating a bit the effect of the loss of wild-caught fish.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it's just I was just thinking of it because there's such a trend in the world, and here in Europe, we have a big trend in aquaculture going up, in Africa and various other places on the continent and the globe. So, and I think FAO is really expecting aquaculture to be feeding our growing populations or the future. Okay, I'll carry on with the questions. So we had, I think you've sort of somewhat answered this already, but it's the question on how is iAtlantic connected to the European Mission of the Oceans and to the ORIA Alliance? You've already mentioned the Belém statement.
Yes, that's right. So as a consortium, we were funded, as part of the network or the collection of projects which were expected and delighted to help implement the Belém statement. And so we've taken that really seriously. To have the ability to not just collaborate with, but properly fund work in the South Atlantic has been critical. And just a quick diversion back to the Galway statement there. The Galway statement ran under slightly different rules, working between Europe and North America. North America being obviously a very wealthy scientific economy. Europe doesn't fund work in North America. It's understandable, but the reality as a coordinator of such projects is, scientists don't have money, they can't do work. And it was hard in those Galway Statement projects to actually, pull things together in a way that we've been able to with Brazil, South Africa, and Argentina in iAtlantic. So a plea to anyone that's listening that has a close hand on those purse strings, you do need to fund things and fund them in a unified way. Ideally, calls that go out so that teams can build and then be reviewed in the same way, in a standardized way. That's anathema to some funders. They always want to use their own funding mechanisms. But we are one planet. We have one set of global challenges. We really ought to bend our bureaucracies to ensure we can empower the science and fund the science. Sometimes it's as simple as that. But that said, Belém is fantastic. Aoria is amazing initiative, and we are fully supportive of the ambitions of those political statements. We think that absolutely essential.
Thank you, and so well said. We are one. We're all interconnected. All right. Clara Manuel asks, could you please elaborate on the case studies in Brazil?
So this is a great one to take live, and I think Angela is our regional coordinator. We have the perfect person to answer your question.
Well, we mean, meaning what other studies we have had in Brazil? That's the question?
Yes, I think we could also just say a little bit about sort of the geographical nature of those studies, the kind of work that went on in those studies. I'd also like to say a little bit about the nice interaction we had with industry to access the mapping data, the multi-beam mapping data.
So we worked on this part of iAtlantic, which is basically working package 3 that Marie was mentioned before, that deals with the modifications through time of ecosystems. But we also worked or try to work, contribute with the mapping, with the working package 2, with the mapping of the deep sea areas in the Brazil. But we are concentrated here in the southeast and the south of Brazil, basically. So we did, we followed 2 ways. One was to, as Murray said, to find out data that was available for us for doing the mapping and the science that we can do with high resolution bathymetry available. And we had an important collaboration from Petrobras that made available some of the data sets they already used for environmental licensing off the coast of Rio de Janeiro. So that was very incredibly useful. So to run habitat suitability models for many species of corals and fish. And so that's one of the paths we walked on, using readily available data to do these predictions of distributions of deep water species. But we also tried, of course, to go there. That's our dream work, to go out in the field and go and use cameras and see the environments. And we actually have a lot of problems with that. It is a very long story. Because that's the most difficult part. Even if you have funding, we learned that even if you have funding, it's still very difficult to have an adequate ship out there and everything works and you get really good material. But we did have one important cruise with the Brazilian vessel Vital de Oliveira to the area of, it's a Navy vessel in the area of the Santos Basin, where we were able to describe very nicely the deep sea area there and structures like pockmarks and canyons and things like that. So we didn't go as far as we wanted to go with that collaboration on that part of the iAtlantic, but we learned lessons, and we, of course, we try to go moving on to try to improve that part. So that's basically the 2 areas. But we also had an important collaboration part of the iAtlantic, specifically in the Espírito Santo University with Angelo Bernardino that worked on those experiments, so in situ and ex situ experiments, tried to understand how the deep sea environments were reacting to the different sorts of perturbations, as Marie already mentioned. So we kind of worked in 3 parts of the iAtlantic, but we concentrated in Espírito Santo, Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and Santa Catarina states.
So I hear from your answer, we still have a long wish list of more data, more research we want to conduct. Yeah,
we miss iAtlantic already.
Yeah. So carrying on from Claudia Almeida again, another question to you again, Angel. She says, I noticed in one of your slides that there is an SST anomaly in Angola in the south border with Namibia. Could you explain what is happening in more detail, how it will affect fishing, not only in Angola, but also Namibia and South Africa?
Well, that's what is in the publication. And in fact, as far as I know, there's a second hotspot in the South Atlantic, which is exactly where you mentioned. but I know very little about that zone. I read a few publications that are sort of describe what's happening there. It's a similar situation that we have here or in this front, where you have here we have a subtropical front, and there in Angola there is another similar front that's moving north-south, and I can't be sure exactly how that works, but that's the explanation. That's part of the explanation why this area is also getting warmer. And again, I would like to think about what could be the consequences for these ecosystems. Of course, I think as you move to the area of the upwelling zone, if that represents some sort of warming of the upwelling zone, the consequences can be very, very, very large, because that's a very productive area of Namibia, right? But if you look at more the northern areas, which are more like tropical, subtropical areas, you could have similar scenarios that I have showed in Southwest Atlantic. But I really don't know what would be a good answer for that.
One thing I'll just mention, we had hoped that on our webinar today we'd have our colleague AJ Schmidt from University of Western Cape in South Africa with us. And AJ is just completing, it's taken slightly longer than the full duration of the project, but he has completed now a heatwave analysis, a marine heatwave analysis for the open ocean Atlantic. It's one of the most extensive attempts to do that, and it's used the framework and modeling framework iAtlantic established in Germany. So it's a really fabulous example of bringing kind of skill sets from Northern Europe together with expertise, technical expertise in South Africa from AJ. I mean, he was the right person to do that analysis. So we look forward to seeing those results. I'm trying to encourage AJ to record us a video. If he does, we'll share that with Valerie and the team, and we can put it onto the final set of products. But I think that would be a really nice thing to have. And please do stay posted for updates on that heatwave analysis.
Thank you for that addition. Yes, I hope we get that video. All right, next question, again for you, Angel. Tropicalization, subtropicalization might also happen near Antarctica? That's a question.
Well, that's a totally different area, not subtropical at all. There's a subantarctic area and then an Antarctic area, but you do have also a front between the subantarctic and Antarctic oceans or regimes, let's say. And I would expect that we will also have changes but based on other physical processes that could actually move that border north and south and result in similar consequences for that fauna. We have to think that these are very cold water species that even a small changes in temperatures can affect drastically these ecosystems.
Okay. Thank you. And a question for Daniel. Does tropicalization affect the total fish catch, or is the decrease primarily due to continuous overfishing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And Joe mentioned already that these two effects are hard to differentiate, because what we're seeing is data from fisheries, right? So fishing is our biggest sampler. So but we're always trying to think on how to separate these effects. And what I can say about it is that the demersal fishing effort did not change, probably went up, but we don't have the long-term database for the whole region, but we do have for Santa Catarina state, which is monitored by Univali, by the university, and a series of projects that it covers. So we do know that the effort changed very little, and the catch fluctuates, but we used when we compare the past and the present, we compared averages for 3 years from the past and averages for 3 years from the present, and these are all periods with good databases, good data sets, and high sampling and good data. So we know that effort was not very different, so we can. And the response of the key species to climate was very strong. So we can infer that climate change has a bigger effect than overfishing does in that specific comparison for the bottom fisheries. But we know, for instance, that one species was being overfished, and it almost disappeared from the catches of the present due to overfishing. That was the I'm getting the name, but peixe sapo in Portuguese. Angel, help me.
Monkfish.
Monkfish, yeah, monkfish, yeah. So monkfish was one of the species that was overfished, and we know that that was not due to climate change. Climate change did not have time to have an effect on the poor monkfish. But overall, we can be sure that comparing those two time frames within the methods that we used, we can conclude that climate change is the bigger effect between the two.
Yeah, can I add something? It's really hard to tell apart, as Daniel mentioned before, but probably we're getting synergistic signals. You having at the same time the process that comes from long time overfishing in Brazil with the new environmental scenario that's also changing the way these populations used to work. And of course, you're getting a synergistic signal both in the same direction. We do have some, as Daniel mentioned, some hints that have helped us to interpret some of the data. He showed in his presentation the actually abundance estimation of some species which are not fisheries, but the biomass estimations of some of the species. And for most of them, we can see that effort is stable, as he said, or decreasing, but biomass is not going up. So we would expect that after some years that this effort is lower, we would have some restoration of biomass to some level. And for most of them, the biomass is maintained low. So that's probably what we could infer as the effect of the climate change that's not allowing these populations to recover. But that's just one hypothesis.
Such complexity. And thank you for that addition. Really helpful. Okay. Also, Daniel, another question. How does this price comparison apply to other regions, namely Central America? Any insights? Is Brazil any different from other countries? How and why?
That's a hard question. Let me just mention for the question Carlos asked before about the overfishing. There are many papers that are addressing these synergistic effects, and one of them, I can't recall the name right now, but I will post it later, did try to isolate one effect and then combine with the other. And of course, when you combine overfishing with climate change, you have more of a dramatic decrease in abundance and on landings. When you isolate only climate change, you have one forecast, and when we add the fisher's response to that, and generally when you don't have enough management, fishers will rush to go to fish before anyone else does. So so that synergistic effect, unfortunately, speeds things up and not slows it down. But then now for the new question on Central America, well, I'm really not sure, because these calculations I presented were made specifically for our region here, for the Brazilian meridional margin, and for the demersal fish. It would be the figures would be different if I was comparing well, pelagic species or another assemblage of fish. But in terms of prices, well, it depends a lot. The prices vary very regionally because it depends on customs. It depends on the type of fish that is being offered in the market. So it would be hard to come to any conclusions without knowing what are the primarily fish being offered in Central America, and how the price relates. Perhaps you have more or less taxes on imported meats, and that changes everything because it depends on what people have available. So yeah, it's really hard to say anything about that. Well, what I do know is that it's well, these calculations are possible. Yeah, they can be done for Central America, and fetching this market prices is not that hard. And since market prices aggregate a lot of information on preferences and on supply, they can be an interesting tool to check for the effects and consequences of fisheries. So that's a good method and not very well, it's not used very seldomly, but I think it can bring interesting results.
Okay, thank you. Another question for you as well. Is there any impact of tropicalization on the fatty acid composition, especially omega-6 and omega-3?
Yeah, definitely, yes. Especially for, well, I'm replying exclusively for these fisheries that I've studied here. And yes, when the composition of the landings change, there is a significant change in the fatty acid composition as well. And because some species, they have higher rates than others, and crustaceans have lower levels of omega-3. So one of the species that is gaining is the hot water affinity shrimp, and it fetches a high market value, so fishers like it. Consumers that can afford also like it because it's a prized food, but in terms of omega-3, we have a loss. And in terms of portability, we also have a loss. The more fishers focus on these species, the more we lose in terms of nutrition, definitely.
Okay, very interesting. So given the complexity of the system, and this is a big question, what would help us understand with perhaps even more certainty what may happen in the future? Because I saw that several of you kind of put some scenarios of what might be coming in the future.
I'm not sure who wants to go first on that. Should we just start with the sort of specifics of the studies on the fish fauna? Because Angel's mentioned some of the other tuna studies that he's carried out, but didn't get very long to speak to that. And then maybe I've got something to say afterwards.
Well, in our region, we can see that clearly that it's coming to a new sort of ecosystem. That's what I expect to see in the coming years. That's much more tropical than it used to be. This region is not only a subtropical region, but it was also influenced by that subtropical confluence dynamics. Like there's a seasonal influence of that of the subantarctic waters that sort of come up to Brazil, the Brazilian area, enrich the area and drop down the temperatures, and there's a lot of the whole ecosystem was adapted to these fluctuations, seasonal fluctuations in the south of Brazil, and we expect that this scenario is becoming weaker and weaker as the time goes past, and we have maybe an ecosystem that looks much more like the ones that we see of Rio, of Bahia, the areas that are more tropical in Brazil, and of course, we're trying to figure out what that will means in terms of economical consequences. Daniel just analyzed, and he will say some about that in a second. But we also look at opportunities. I mean, there could be opportunities, actually, because the way we use the marine system, it depends on human demands. And for example, as he mentions, the pink shrimp is highly valued. I mean, for many people, the idea that pink shrimp may be going up is an excellent news because it's valued so much and everybody loves that. But even though we're losing some nutritional contents, of course. What we are trying to figure out now is what are the losses, but also what are the opportunities that will come. And one of the opportunities that we're looking at is another work that we've been conducting in our lab here with another PhD student, is the fact that we'll see these changes in an area that goes across the border between Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. And maybe that change will be an excellent opportunity for these countries again sit down and try to figure out if this was not the time to again plan some sort of mutual management of this area, one that includes a lot of changes that is affecting not only Brazil side, but also the Uruguay and Argentina side. So that'd be maybe an opportunity for collaboration in terms of international management of resources based on climate change. So of course, that what I mean is that we are trying to figure out what are we going to lose in terms of what we already have, but we also have to focus in this new world that's coming, and maybe it's not so bad as we think that it is.
And Valerie, just to add to that, I guess one of the things that we're all grappling with as scientists and as society is that now, everything is changing everywhere all at once, right? And it's really hard to pick apart trends, but that doesn't mean those trends can't be understood and can't be picked apart. And I've just got a couple of other examples from iAtlantic and of course work of colleagues around the world. So I happen in my research to focus a lot on deep sea corals, cold water corals, and they calcify, they make calcium carbonate skeletons already in areas of the ocean that are quite close to being corrosive. So you don't have to add that much more carbon dioxide into the water for that water just to become naturally corrosive to their skeletons. If it's corrosive, the skeleton, when it's dead, just dissolves. Now these deep sea reefs are built on the foundations of their dead ancestors, right? That's why they're big reefs. If the water around them becomes corrosive, they will start to disappear. Look in the North Pacific, which present day is an old water mass naturally rich in carbon dioxide. There are very few patches of these types of deep sea corals, whereas in the North Atlantic, where it's a very conducive environment for those skeletons, they're massive mounds, hundreds of meters high, that have lasted for hundreds of thousands of years in some cases, and support lots of other species. In iAtlantic, we've researched that, we've looked at that tipping point, we've got into the details of the skeleton and how it's breaking down, and it's really probably going to be faster than we thought it was. And that's a game changer, right? That's areas I've been lucky enough to work on them for about 25 years, but probably by the end of my life, they'll be dissolving. And at the end of my children's lives, that will be really, really stark. I don't think there's much we can do about that because we're not limiting CO2 emissions. We also made a very interesting discovery on Mirabilis 2, that flagship expedition to Capo Verde. The landers we put down, the seabed instrumentation that sits on the seafloor, recorded some really interesting parameters. We brought the cores back up to the surface and we incubated them on deck, and we found that in very simple terms, if we up the ambient temperature by a degree, the respiration rates of those cores dramatically increases. The carbon storage potential of that region of the abyssal ocean, which is the largest habitat on planet Earth, dramatically declines. So all of these results are massively important and relevant. And let's not forget, as we talk about acidification, we talk about warming, we also have deoxygenation spreading in huge areas of the global ocean. Lots of things matter to life, but most life does rely on oxygen. This is something we need to understand much better, which leads me to my final point. To get this where it needs to be, we've got to maintain ocean observation. We've got to make it cheaper. I didn't have time to talk to you today about the work we put into increasing access to low-cost ocean obs technologies. So these might be camera systems that you can drop down on ropes. You can build them in your shed, literally in your back garden shed, for about 12 to 13,000 euros, similar amount of US dollars. Go survey a seamount from a small vessel for about 15 to 20,000 euros. That's unprecedented. We've also been increasing and upscaling access to the parameters of ocean acidification. So how do you measure ocean acidification in seawater? All these things need to be shared around the world. And if you're interested, again, the website's got lists of all these kind of technology advances, innovation advances. And that's been an important part of our work, but not one we had much time, sadly, to go into today. But do check the website for more.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's, I think, a really good place to close, because I think it's kind of, I love how you've touched on, okay, there's some challenges, but there's also perhaps some really great opportunities coming. Yes, we see there's a change. Yes, this current is getting slower. I've heard the word tipping point, but yet we still are remaining very positive. We know there's change coming. It's not all necessarily bad or doom or gloom. There are opportunities and possibilities. There's also been a shout out for people to come on board, help us solve this data that we want to gather through means of maybe cheaper technology, more accessible technology. So a shout out to people that are listening. We are a project, the Blue Mission Atlantic and Arctic is a project about blue innovation, finding solutions. So, so we'll throw that in there as well. And I'm really looking forward to the continuation. I know it's not going to be an iAtlantic 2 necessarily, but the research will carry on. People out there that are listening, if you have means, whether that's in resources, staff, please get in touch with these scientists here today and others and help us by gathering more data and filling the gaps that we still have so we can understand better what this means for all species, both underwater and above water, and us on our land masses too. Any last words before we say goodbye to our wonderful also participants? And thank you for all your great questions.
Just a quick thank you from me to you, Valerie, and to the whole team at the Air Centre, and to my colleague in Edinburgh, Ayla Basima, who's done a great job pulling this all together and making sure that we had people ready to talk today. And thanks to everyone for listening.
And thank you. Thank you for staying a little bit longer. Bye for now.
Bye. Thank you.
Hello, bye-bye, thank you.